met them right in sort of the beginning stages of me actually coming to Japan. So yeah, I'm here because I'm just trying to process everything that's happening back in the States and trying to wrestle with my own heart here.
Well, I think I'm doing this for the exact same reason, Jessica. I'm trying to figure out what should I think about these things. So, Jessica, you go ahead and go. And in the meantime, I'm going to check my phone to see if there's anybody that wasn't able to get in.
I know Josh from my high school Bible study. Although I think I joined it after you had already gone to college, so it was mostly when David and your mom were leading it. And yeah, I would love to hear Josh's perspective because I think he's got a lot of wisdom to offer, and I also am very much unsure what to make of a lot of different things, and it's all very overwhelming. I also have a newborn, so I'm a little distracted. It's hard to stay up with all of the news and all the things that are being said about so many different things. And
you've got a newborn, Jessica. I don't think you need to watch any news. Just worry about what's right in front of you.
Yeah. So but I think I actually am preparing to homeschool my older child who's almost 3, and so I know Josh has a lot of great stuff to say about history, and I think it'll be helpful to kind of have some good foundation because my public school education didn't really help me with that. So I will glean what I can from Josh.
That's great. I like Jessica. So then Savvy and Cody, I think you're the last 2 for today. So Savvy, good to see you.
Hi.
So we're all introducing each other. So go ahead. This is your 30 seconds of fame right here.
What am I talking about? Why I'm here?
Yeah, sure. Or just how we know each other, whatever.
Oh, I got stuck with him, or he got stuck with me for 3 years of college.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. Everybody's still pissed off about that.
What you're going to talk about, but I think it's good to hear it again.
Awesome.
And have a new conversation and new information, probably.
Yeah, great.
Pretty much it.
And Cody, you're last. Cody's still figuring out the system here, I think. Okay. Wait a second. You can mute and unmute yourself at the bottom left there, Cody, if you're still working with it here. Okay. Well, I'll give him another minute. I think that's everybody. Let me double check. Oh, audio not working. Okay. Can you guys still hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, everyone else can hear me. Okay, all right. Troubleshooting here. Okay, let's see. I'm trying to do tech support here. Okay, Cody, you can hear me? Okay, great. That's fine. All right. Well, if you want to mess around with your mic and get working later, that's cool, but I'll go ahead and get started. So just I want to keep it really brief, really easy tonight. My goal is to try to do this on a semi-regular basis every week, do a couple of these on different topics. The reason why I'm doing this, because the world is freaking crazy. And my response when I don't understand what's going on is to try to think like, okay, what is this a part of? What is this connected with? And that's the historian in me. In particular, I want to help especially Christians think about how do we as people that believe in justice, but also believe that human beings are really screwed up and that history is a long catalog of human beings being jerks to each other. How do we think wisely about what to do in the now? That's basically my kind of that's kind of the angle I'm going for here. So that's why we're doing this. And we're going to do, like I said on the email, 20 or 30 minutes, me kind of giving you a short story. Here's something to think about. Here's a perspective. And I just want to talk with you guys and kind of see how it it sits with you. Okay, I have another person adding here. Fight Club. I don't even know who this is. All right. Okay, we'll see. Could be. I'm really excited to see who's randomly bombing our call here. All right. Okay. Oh, Stephanie's trying to join. Click on the link. Sorry. Click the link. I should have built in 15 minutes to get ready. Sorry. All right. Did everyone get the PowerPoint that I put on Facebook?
Oh, no.
I tried to send a file. Let's see if it actually went out or not.
Look.
Yes, I got it.
You got, okay, cool. It should be there then. Okay. All right, let's see. Just let me get in. Oh, okay. Hang on just a second. If you try to join, I should be able to click admit. So just try again, and I'll click admit. All right. Hang on a second. Man, I really need like some good Jeopardy music right now. Sorry. Okay. By the way, as far as you guys, I don't know who amongst you have used Zoom. Do you guys like speaker view or or do you like the tile? Which do you prefer?
I like the tile.
Tile. Okay. Here we go. I think we should get it in now. Let's see if that works. Because what I was going to do is, because I'm gonna kind of monopolize the first 20 minutes. So I was going to start with speaker and then switch to tile once we're kind of all talking. So, all right, Stephanie, can you hear me? Let's see if that works. All right, so I think Stephanie is joining. So John, what you drinking?
Widmer upheaval.
Okay, I respect that. Good choice.
Yeah, I'm a beer snob, so.
I think the technical term that's a can check. So yeah, I just want to see what's going on. All right. Okay, Stephanie, do I have you? Are you live? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. I'm trying to get it. There it is.
There you go. Hey, there's Cody. We can see Cody now. Okay, great, Stephanie. All right. Well, we'll get going now. We've spent enough time futzing around, so we'll just get rolling, and then we'll get into discussion after that. So I put on Facebook. I sent out a PowerPoint presentation, but I'll try to we'll kind of work through it together. So let's see if I can share the screen. I don't know how effective that will be. Try. I'm gonna try share screen. Okay, tell me, can you guys see my PowerPoint there?
Yeah.
Okay, great. All right, we'll just start here. So I want to talk really briefly today about slaves and serfs in the early modern world. And I know it sounds really weird that I want to talk about like George Floyd and like riots about race in the Middle Ages, but I'm a historian. I have to go here. And the reason why I want to is one of the things that I've been thinking about is how do we, as human beings, how do we build systems that are so fundamentally inhumane? Why? And we're good at this, right? We've been doing this a very long time, and we keep making systems that are really cruel. And so I guess I want to go back and be like, okay, how do we even get slavery in the first place? So our questions for today are basically along that line. How could a system, this is going to be the first of multiple conversations if you guys want to be a part. So we're going to go all the way to today. I want to start way early. So be kind. Yeah, Savvy's shaking her head. She's like, oh no, Dr. Rice is doing it again. Yeah, I can't help but go back. So we want to start asking, how could a system like this emerge? And the next question I want to ask is, okay, in the Atlantic world, what was labor like? What was it like to be a working person in the, in the early, late Middle Ages or the early modern period? So the first two words we want to talk about are feudalism or manorialism. You guys have probably heard of feudalism before. Who here has heard that word or thinks they know what it might mean? Savvy, you can't answer. You're a historian, so you're a history major, so you're disallowed from answering this.
I've heard it, but I don't remember what it means.
Okay. Good answer. Good honesty there, John.
Hey, can you let my other device in, the one that I want to stream you on? It's called Fight Club.
Oh yeah. I didn't know what the name was about, but go ahead, Stephanie.
You don't want to know. Just can
You know about Fight Club?
Okay.
Oh, we have a
Yeah, we stream fighting classes through.
Oh yeah, you're doing that. I forgot about that. Okay, well, that makes sense. Well,
Could you let me in on that one? Sorry.
Sure. Okay, I think I need to stop sharing. Here you go, participants. Sorry about that. Oh, there you go. Okay, admit. There you go. Now you should be good. Okay. All right.
Thank you.
There we go. Okay, great. All right. So back to my question. So, anyone want to try a definition of feudalism, or what have you heard about that before? What is that word connected for you?
I feel like I've heard of it in the context of Japan, but I don't know that I could define it.
Yeah, that's actually a really good connection, Jessica. Feudalism is the word we generally use to define any area where the ownership of land is how you base the whole society. So when you think like knights and lords and nobles, you're thinking feudalism. And that happened both in Europe and in Japan. So it's not exclusively a European thing. But where we're starting kind of our investigation here is we're starting in the late Middle Ages, so maybe we're around 1300 or so. I'm just throwing out a date. And this era, sometimes called feudalism, sometimes called manorialism because it's based around manors. And this is kind of the way to think about it. In this era, you've got this cool, this picture's from 2 centuries later, but this is a picture of peasants working here in somewhere in north central Europe, working on the land. I don't know if they're cutting hay or what they're doing, maybe it's wheat, but most of Europe and most of human history has been defined by human labor. And that's, I think, one of the weirdest things for us to get our heads around, right? Is that we live in a world where machines do so much of our work, but human labor has been the constant in human history. And in the Middle Ages, this was what it looked like. So here you're seeing a picture of a medieval manor run by a lord or the guy who lives. Can you see my cursor here?
Yeah.
Okay, so the Lord lives right here at the manor house, and he's the center of all this land. There's the church. There's land that's called the glebe. That's all these little hashed areas. That's owned by the church. And then all these beige areas are what's called the domain, which is actually where we get our word. If I say like he has domain, that's where the word comes from. It's from the French word meaning those beige lands. And the domain is land that's owned by the Lord. And all the peasants, the serfs who live there, have to work on that land a couple days every week. So how it might work is if you live maybe in France in, let's say, 1250, probably how it would work is you'd have, welcome, Nick. You might have free days 4 or 5 days a week, 2 or 3 days a week. You have to work for your Lord a certain amount. And if you're a serf, you cannot leave the land if you want to. You can't get a new boss. You are bound to that land. And if that Lord, let's pretend the guy who runs the manor house, if he runs out of money and has to sell some land, if you live on that land, you are sold too. Wow. So these people are not slaves. That's important to note. But you are so tied to the land that when people talk about an area of country, they mean physically the land and all the people who work it. And you count as landscape in some level. You guys see kind of why I'm going here? If you want to get slavery, you need a system that's ready. Oh, go ahead. Somebody said, I think, go ahead, Stephanie, were you saying something?
I just said
Yeah, so you can kind of see the implication I'm getting at here, right? That we already have a system of labor where human beings aren't people, they're property tied to land, right? And sometimes this isn't slavery. You have certain rights. For instance, if your master, if you're the lord of your manor is unusually abusive, you could maybe try to talk to the local priest or maybe a nearby monastery. There are some extremely basic legal rights you have. I don't mean much. I mean like rape is not allowed. A manor lord can't commit rape, but that's about it. He can't kill you, but he can basically do anything else. So this is not slavery. You with me here? But this is not exactly a free labor situation. These are people who are held in something very much like bondage. Okay. So the reason why this is important is this is what Europe is like before the New World's discovered. There was no Atlantic slavery yet, but there's already this system of land ownership and labor where men who are called lords get land from the king and they own the people nearly. They have almost complete control over the people on their property. Okay. So
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So what makes them tied to it? So they're just dependent on it because it's all owned and they have nowhere else to go and that's where they get their sustenance, or What
No.
ties them there?
What ties them there is their legal status as serfs. So, John, there were people who broke the law and just ran away. As a matter of fact, and this is kind of fun if you're Scots, a lot of Scots Irish people, they're that because they ran away from their lords and said, screw it, I'm going to live up way in Scotland where it's the terrible weather and no one wants to be. And a lot of lords are like, you know what, screw it, I'm not going to go up there and try to get them. And so some peasants, some serfs just ran away and figured, I'd prefer to live off the land than get stuck here. But you legally are tied to the land. And the way it would work, good question, John, is the idea was your kids would be connected to the land. So theoretically, your offspring for all of time would work that same ground. And your Lord, his eldest son, would for all time be in charge of your kids. And so the medieval mind has this assumption that basically the history will never change. The families that live in this land will do what they're doing right now forever.
Okay.
And again, you can kind of hear the echoes, don't you? That sounds like some other things I know about. There's this sense of let me use a key word in slavery studies. This is something that's inheritable. If I don't do anything, I will be just like my dad. If I don't do anything, my Lord, his son, will be just like what his dad is. They're all going to be the same. So this is a very static, unchanging world as people in it understood it. Okay, let's move on. Thanks for joining, Colin. Thanks for joining, Nick. Sorry we got started on the wrong foot here. Another part of this story is to look at how little things change. I love this graph. Check out this bad boy here. So this is per capita GDP from BC 500 to today. Now, hopefully you will notice before about 1800, there's almost zero growth. This is what's so crazy about history, you guys. If you ask the average person in the late Middle Ages, 1400, which is the high Middle Ages, if you said, hey, what is life like in Bible times? They'd say, it's like now. And you said, what was life like when God made the world? They'd say, oh, like now. And if you said, what will life be like 2,000 years from now? They'd say, like now. The essential assumption was that history is not a flat, not a line. Like we tend to think history is like this, right? It's going somewhere. People in the Middle Ages didn't believe history was going anywhere. They thought it was a circle. And the circle is based around yearly cycles of harvests and winters and springs and summers. And all of history has always done this, and it never changes. And so to understand what labor is like in these years, we have to just basically start from the assumption that nothing ever changes. If you want to get real specific, between 1600 and 1700, for instance, the growth over the century is 6%. Can you imagine the U.S. economy, if it grows like 1%, everyone gets mad and pissed off? That's 1600 to 1700, 6 to 7% for a century. That's what we're talking about here. Okay, Cody, I think Cody's still here with us.
All right, I'm finally figured things out.
Okay, all right, glad to have you, Cody. All right.
Wasn't
Let's
sure
see.
I could come today, but
Yeah,
I got time, so that was good.
Good, glad to have you join. So we're just talking about kind of how things are changing or not changing in the Middle Ages. Here's another graph. This is just telling us the same thing. If you look more closely from 1270 on, you can see why I like this graph. It starts more recently. Notice how flat the line is just about to the middle of the 18th century. So again, if we're thinking where does slavery come from, we are believing in a world that's fundamentally static, that doesn't really change, and systems of inheritable labor are assumed. They're everywhere. You guys with me on this so far?
Mm-hmm.
I'll give you one more detail. I took this from a biography of William Wilberforce. Anyone know that name, William Wilberforce?
Yes.
How do you know that name?
I learned about him in my Western Thought and Culture class. He was from what I remember, an abolitionist in England.
Yeah, you're right, Colin. Yeah, he was the guy who basically ended slavery in the British Empire.
Yes.
So there's a great biography on him written about 10 years ago, and the author does a bunch of historical study to try to figure out how common is freedom. And he concludes that around 1800, it wasn't half, 70% of the world is unfree. Let me say that again. In 1800, 70% of the world is unfree. And again, look at our graph here. People just aren't making very much. To give you a word, sometimes this period is called Malthusian. That's a $5 word. Let me give you I'll put that in the chat so you can see what that word is. Malthusian. It's from David Malthus. And basically what David Malthus said was, well, when a bunch of people make a bunch of extra food, all the peasants have a bunch of kids. And then those kids start eating too much food and a bunch of them die. And then they start getting more efficient, getting more food, so they have more kids, and those kids eat too much and they all die. And so the theory is that economies never grow. They grow a little and they create, then too many people are born, and then those people die off, returning us to where we were. So when you think about that system, you have a system where there's no economic change, there's very little freedom, and the average person experiences bondage as a daily reality for most human beings. Doesn't matter if you're in China, Japan, England, France, Africa, China, India, it probably doesn't matter. The vast majority of people are bound to labor, whether it's legally, whether it's by slavery, or whatever else. Okay.
And are you defining slavery as kind of a slave, as somebody who's owned and has to work unpaid?
That's one way to do it. I think the way that I would use it is slavery is direct legal ownership. So that's why serfs aren't slaves, because they're not legally owned. They're legally tied to the land stuff. So that would be the distinction, right? So like if an enemy came over and took over a lord's manor, right? He would get to keep all the people. He can't do what he wants with them. He would just get all the land. And so literally what would happen if you had, say, the English and French fought a bunch. If the English take over an area of land, they literally would go to the serfs and say, what was your deal with your lord? Whatever his deal is, I'll give you, because the people are part of the land. Whatever their rights are, and again, by rights, I mean very little. Whatever their rights are, you work these days for me. You have to give me this much wheat every year. You get 6 pence from me whenever you get married. Whatever the rules are, they just transfer it to whoever the lord was, because you're part of the land. So not slave. So the key here is that 70% of people are unfree. Notice I didn't say 70% are slaves. Most people in the pre-modern world were not slaves. They were unfree labor. You get the distinction there? So they're often tied by different types of labor systems, but they're not actually owned. So if you wanted to go to the Bible, right? The Bible's got all examples of slaves, both in the Old and New Testament. And most of those slaves do not inherit their status. They're purchased or sold. So that's a type of slavery that is more temporary. It's not inheritable, but it's, that's one type of unfreedom that we find in history. Okay, good question, Stephanie. Anybody else have a question before we move on?
Side note, can you hear me now? This is Cody.
Yeah, I can hear you great. Thanks, Cody.
All right.
Yes. So I hate to be a bother on the slavery question, but
No, it's fine.
would you say, because I believe this was about the Civil War, yes?
Yeah.
So is the difference of slavery here between the chattel slavery and then, like, I suppose, pre-18th century slavery?
Chattel slavery, well, we're going to get to that, Colin. Chattel slavery definitely exists beforehand, but I'm just trying to set up the larger question, which is what type of freedom and unfreedom exist in the world before we get to African slavery. So
All right.
since you asked the question and Steph did, African slavery in the United States is very unique because it's two things. One, it's completely inheritable. You will always get it if your parents are. And two, it's completely racialized. Okay, we're going to unpack why that is in future sessions, but that's what's unique. Like, again, think about the Bible. Lots of people in the Bible are slaves or not. It has nothing to do with their race, and it has nothing to do with their parents. Maybe they got sold because their dad ran out of money, but they're not lifetime inherited. Their kids aren't slaves. It doesn't happen because they're a certain race. So American slavery is very unique, but we're still trying to figure out what types of other unfreedom are out there. So good question, Connie. You're thinking the right direction. I'm trying to give the long, 500-year answer to that question.
Apologies.
No, that's fine. So next, we've talked about what life is like in Europe and much of the world where unfreedom of various sorts is really common. So next, and we got about maybe 10 minutes left, then we'll go to Q&A. Next, we want to go to Africa because, of course, to get American slavery, you need Africans to get what American slavery becomes. Now, this is from a Catalan Atlas in 1381. The guy in the middle there with the gold sweet crown, check out that thing. Come on, that guy's pretty BA. That This guy named Mansa Musa is a famous African emperor. He runs the kingdom of Mali. And what this map is showing us here is, see all these cities? These are all African cities in the Sahel, which is a part of Africa. So specifically, you can see here, this is the Sahel. And the Sahel is basically the area of land between the Sahara Desert and, and basically Central Africa. Now, Sahel is a really fascinating word because in Arabic, it literally means coastline. So ask yourself, what ocean is this next to? No one wants to take a guess at this. It's kind of a trick question.
It appears to not be on the coast.
It appears to not be on the coast, but the coast actually is right here. The Sahara is the ocean. We think of the Sahara as an impassable area of land, but in fact, the Sahara was a place of tons of trade in the late Middle Ages. In fact, really, it's a time of trade going back to the early centuries of AD. And so the Arabic traders called this land the coastline because once you leave the coast, you go right into the ocean and you can go anywhere. The world's your oyster. And so we have to remember that even as Europe is in this static, unchanging world of feudalism with lords and serfs, North Africa is actually surprisingly dynamic. People move up and down trade networks all through the Sahara. And even though the Sahara is very dry, it's a place that people cross all the time, like it's not a big deal, which boggles my mind, but we know they crossed it. Actually, fun fact, this is just a freebie. You guys know where the word Sahara comes from? The story is that Arabic traders believed that when you died of thirst, the last thing you caught was like as you're dying. And so the word Sahara is like the sound of a person dying of thirst. So that's kind of a fun freebie. Anyways, so now that we remember this is a coast, there's a word Sahara and Sahel. This area's got empires in it. So the Mali Empire is here, Timbuktu and Gao. There's multiple other empires, and many of these we know almost nothing about. The history on these empires has really only started being written the last 20 or 30 years. This is terrible, but as late as 1976, there was a meeting of American historians, and the president of the AHA said, again, it's like 75, 76, he said, there is no history of Africa. He was literally like, there's nothing to study. There's just nothing has ever happened there, which is wrong and also racist. But here we go. So we've got empires here, centered mostly around the Niger River. So this is what it looked like in 1400. Unlike Europe, which is pretty slow, Africa has all these trade networks running north and south through the Sahara with, again, the Mali Empire here, Ghana, and other empires, including Zimbabwe and the Zanzibar coast, tons of city-states, almost like ancient Greece, traded all up and down this coast here. So basically what I want you guys to see here is that this is what the world looks like in the Atlantic world. There's all this trade going around the edges of the continent. And this is the other key point, is that these are slave trade routes. So now what this means is that before the Europeans ever discover the New World, I'll put discover in big scare quotes because there were people there already, as we all know, but before the Europeans ever get there, they already have a system of labor that's pretty unfree in feudalism. And in Africa, there's already a system of slave trading. Now, most of the trading that happens in North Africa tends to use POWs. Basically, if I'm, let's say, I'll make something up. If I'm somebody in Ghana and I'm attacking another African city-state, if I capture 20 people, I don't want to take them home. So I just go to the next door, Arabic trader and say, hey, would you like to take these people? I don't need them. Give me some cash. Now, the number of people in this trade are very few comparatively. We're talking in the thousands of people, not hundreds of thousands or millions, which is the number we're going to get. So in other words, we're in an era where Europeans are unfamiliar with free labor. Most people are bound, but you're bound to your lord by land. You're bound by different sorts of legal structures, but it's not slavery as we're going to see. And Africans are familiar with slavery, but it's normally what happens when you lose a war and when the Arabic trader shows up and says, what do you got for me? That's what things are like. This is not, we're not here yet. This is a picture from David Livingston's book from the 19th century. We're going to eventually have full slave gangs marching people through Africa, but that's not how this starts. It starts in the cities. So this right here is from the 1700s. I can't remember the exact date. This is in a trade city on the African coast. So you can see here how, where is this here? Xavier, Sabi. Basically, there's this town here right by the water, and each European country builds a little zone where they keep their slaves. So there's the palace here to hang out. There's the English zone. There's the French zone. There's the Portuguese zone. And basically what happens is Africans now realize, instead of finding an Arabic trader who takes 5 people off your hands, you can march a whole captured village. You can take the whole thing right over to the holding pits at this port city, and the whole lot of them will get sold, and you'll get the proceeds. You guys tracking with me so far? So what we're seeing here is how Europeans have systems of labor that they're already quite comfortable with, that we would, I think, all call pretty unfair and inhumane. And Africans already have a system of slavery that kind of greases the wheels. It's a way to deal with your enemies. And the two systems, as you know, are going to come together. You know what? It's 8:32. Do you guys want me to do 10 more minutes, or should we stop here? I'll leave it up to you.
10 more minutes.
Keep talking.
Okay, keep going. All right.
I'm along for the ride.
Okay. We have a thumbs up for Chad. Thanks, guys. Okay, all right. We'll go a little bit further. So what we know when we think about Atlantic slavery, we're thinking about what's often called the Middle Passage. The Middle Passage, which is the route between the continents, right? From Africa, some port in Africa to some port in North or South America or the Caribbean. And that's coming. But what I want you guys to see in the setup is how all the dominoes are in a row, if you will, to make the system possible. In the case of the Middle Passage, the English have started developing much more effective managerial methods. And when you think about like what's cool in history, you know what's not sexy? Management, not cool. But actually, the English ability to run numbers and keep track of things. Well, I mean, that's Amazon, right? Like logistics is the new thing, right? Well, logistics in the 17th century made the English empire grow a lot more wealthy because they knew what was where. When you apply logistics to boats and slaves, you get this. This is from the 1790 and 91 investigation where the House of Commons wanted to figure out what's going on with the slave trade. Now, I want you to think about that date. This is 1790. How long has the slave trade been going on? At least 100 years officially and probably 200 years more unofficially. So it took the English a long time to actually investigate. But you can kind of see here the kind of, I don't know, I'm looking for the word, like the craven genius in it. That if you've got a system where people are available, you can make a lot of money. You just got to bodily pack them in there. So we have here, this is they can fit 292 slaves on this boat. So this is the bottom deck, this is the upper deck, and they separate it by sex, men, women, and they got boys in the middle. The girls stay at the women, the boys are in this weird zone. So this is a fascinating thing, right? So these slavers think enough about the humanity of slaves to separate them by gender. I mean, not enough to do anything for them as people otherwise, but they do recognize gender difference. I think it's kind of an amazing moment of human and inhumanity. We'll close kind of with this thought. We're Americans, so we all have a very particular view, but check out this. This is the first century. This is 1519 to 1600s, our first column here, 1519 to 1700. How many Africans went to the North American colonies? 1.9%. Where did they go? I went here, the Spanish American mainland. Because we're English, we tend to think the English have always been kicking butts, but they didn't start in charge. The early years of the colonial era were run by the Portuguese and the Spanish. And so the people who had the most money got the most slaves. And so the Spanish were the ones who really got the slave trade going in the first 2 centuries of it. And the bulk of them were sent to Spanish colonies, all mostly in South America, but also especially the Caribbean. So you can see here we got the Dutch Caribbean, 6%. Saint Domingue. Saint Domingue is going to become very, very important, but not yet. Barbados. Barbados was the one English jewel. We don't know the exact numbers, but something like 70% of all English slaves anywhere at least stopped over in Barbados. So Barbados was the one colony the English had that really was making a lot of money out of the slave trade. But hopefully you get my point here. The English are kind of Johnny-come-latelys, aren't they? They're kind of slow to get on board the system. They'll eventually take over. Once we get to the 18th century, England's going to become much more important, shipping to North America and Barbados. So the thought I kind of want to close with, if we kind of wrap this up. When you look at where the African slave trade goes, it doesn't really go to places we think, does it? You have more slaves going to Asia. Check that out. You have more slaves going to India and the Middle East than you do to the North American colonies. So what we have to remember when we're trying to understand where slavery comes from is America is important today, but in 1650, there's like 200,000 white people on the whole continent. Nobody knows or cares about it. And so where American slavery comes from, first off, and this is kind of the conclusion of this first discussion here, is it comes from the edges. It comes from this big, truly global story, and the North American colonies are this tiny little segment of it. So what we're going to have to investigate this as we get into this, in the next couple of sessions or whatever, is how does American slavery become so important? Because if it's 1650 and you ask the average American colonist, how important is slavery? They wouldn't understand you. They'd say, this isn't Barbados. This isn't Saint Domingue. This isn't Brazil. What do you mean slavery is important? In fact, I would go so far as to say before about 1680, a lot of colonists in North America have probably seen one or two black people their whole life. So we have to ask, where on earth did we get this system? And the first answer that we're going to end with on this section today is it came from an international development connecting European labor models to African internal wars. That's what we're going to unpack more next couple times. So that's what I got for you guys so far today. Let me hear it. Let's get some questions. Let's get talking. This is the best part.
So
Okay.
who is transporting all of these slaves to all these different places? Like the country where they're going to?
Actually, oftentimes, here's another stat showing the same thing. Look at that, Brazil, 38% of all slaves went to Brazil. And the Caribbean, check that out. The Caribbean's so important. We'll talk about why later. Was that Stephanie asking the question? I couldn't see.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Stephanie, if you look at the carriers, you can actually see how that changes. So right here, the first 2 centuries, the bulk, look at that, half is Portugal. Here's what's crazy. When we think of pirates, maybe you've heard like the Spanish Main or whatever, the Spanish had really big colonies, but the Portuguese made most of their money just selling slaves. That was what ran that empire.
This is by carrier. Okay.
Go ahead, sorry.
Oh, I see. So this one's by carrier.
Yeah,
I understand.
Right, and so we get the British they're the second most important that first century, 20%, and by the second century of slavery, 1700 to 1800, they're the largest country, 40%, France at 18, Portugal still at 30%. So it's really fascinating that actually a lot of times if you find slaves in the records, they often have Portuguese last names. And when you think about it, that makes a lot of sense. It's probably because they stole a name from, some Portuguese sailor and said, well, I got to have a last name now, so I might as well get it from this dude, Good question. Somebody else.
So I think you already covered this somewhat, but I might have missed it. What exactly led Africans to sell off other Africans?
Well, I think the key to remember is that for them, this is a prisoner of war situation. So they don't think of this as I'm selling these people to lifetime slavery. They're like, hey, again, this is Bible times, John. So it's like you capture people, you win a war, you defeat the city, you sell the people into servitude, right? So they don't have any notion of this as a lifetime, an inheritable, or even a racialized thing, right? You've got Africa. Let me change the question, John. If you've got 2 African tribes and they fight each other, do they say, hey, we're on the same team because we're black? They're from different tribes. So they don't see themselves and say, you know what, we're selling our own people into slavery. They say, I'm selling the people from that city state. I hate those guys. I'm getting rid of them and making some cash. So
Okay.
actually, I love that you asked that question, John, because one of the things we've learned in the last 50 years is that the African city-states, they don't really start connecting the racial lenses Europeans have until much later. We're talking until the mid-1700s. You have the first Africans saying, wait a second, I know he's Yoruba and I'm Xhosa or Ngoingoi, but they don't think about it for a long time because it doesn't concern them, right? The only person who sees a Nigerian and a Rwandan and says, oh, they're the same, is a European, right? So that's the whole point, is you have to make it truly racialized, you have to pull them out of Africa to make them just black. In the same way that if you told an Englishman, hey, you're just white, he'd be like, excuse me, I'm in the realm of the king. I hate the French. The Dutch are okay because they're Protestants. Like they wouldn't know what white meant either. And so we have to remember that our racial words and terminologies and distinctions, they don't exist in the 1600s. They're developing over time.
Well, I just realized that question came out of a nationalist worldview. You know, and it just dawned on me while you were saying that that wasn't really present there. So
yeah, it's hard to go back into their mindset, right? Because we just think people are connected to their countries, but we're in an era where it's like, what are countries? Because like English people don't have a country, they have a king, and there's different countries inside it. So what is it's difficult. Last thing I'd make on that point would be that one of the big changes was in the first 10 to 20 years, like the middle years of the 20th century, a lot of scholars of slavery basically thought it was Europeans showing up, stealing black people and leaving. And it becomes that, don't mishear me. But the first 100 to 200 years of slavery, Africans are part of the trade because they see the benefit in it and because they're empires, right? See, we don't think Africa, we hear Africa, we don't think big empires. Do you believe that empires might sell people? I can believe that, but we don't think Africa has empires, so we don't think there'd be inequality or unfairness there. But once you remember, wait, they're people living in big societies. Oh, I bet they do really terrible things too. So the sad reality, you guys, is we have, and this is where I'll show my cards, we have a really inhumane, cruel system in Europe that embeds directly into another inhumane system in Africa. And they fuse and flower into this whole new thing that's more terrible than either system alone. And again, like the Christian in me is like, yep, that sounds like people, all right. But that's kind of what happens here. So good question, John. Somebody else. Yeah, I gotta give you a minute. A minute. I'll tell you what, I'm gonna get some tea. I'll be back in like 30 seconds. All right, I'm back.
So there were other wars and disagreements going on in other places. Were there other people being shipped off as the effect of after war as prisoners of war also? I mean, was it significantly more from Africa?
No, it really wasn't. In fact, the word slave, maybe you guys know this, slave comes from the word Slav, like Slavic, like a Russian-speaking person. That's the word slave comes from, because back in the day, a lot of the Eastern European countries, I did it, John. They're not really countries yet, but the people groups in Eastern Europe that speak Slavic languages, Russian, Croatian, Czech, whatever. Actually, not Czech, but they tend to be very easy to steal because there's no major kingdoms. If you're in France, you're protected by the French king. If you live in Central Europe, Germany, there's no Germany yet, but there's lots of pretty powerful duchies and states. But if you're in Eastern Europe, there's nobody out there until you get out to Muscovy, which becomes Russian. So there's lots of room to kind of snag people. And so that's why there's this That's why the word slavery itself means this group of people, Stephanie. So it's very common. And actually, on that point, since you mentioned it, do you guys know the word robot? You know where we got that from? It's from robota, which is the Czech word for their duties to the Lord, like their duties to their man or owner. So it's like literally our language has changed because everyone knows, you know who's a robot who can't do what they want? The Czech people, robota. So it's like, it's amazing how literally our language has been changed by how dominant Czech lords were over the Serfs. So
Wow.
did that answer your question?
Yeah. Thank you.
So it's one of those terrible things. You're like, why didn't anyone? Why is this so common? Well, again, I have a theological answer for that.
So what I'm hearing is when people say robots are going to take over the world, they're talking about the Czechs
Yes, that's
taking over the planet.
Thank you, Colin. I love it. That's great. All right, somebody else. We'll spend maybe 5-10 more minutes and go from there.
Prior to the collision of, I guess, European culture with African culture and that kind of things happening and accelerating slave, were there Black folks documented anywhere else around the world prior to that point, or distinguished as having dark skin, or was that the first introduction of African people or Black skinned people anywhere in the world?
That's a great question. We actually do know that there were Africans in Europe. They weren't common, but because those trades, those Arabic trading networks, there were a handful of Black people, pretty much as long as we have records in Europe. Every now and then they pop up. And that's actually what's so fascinating, Chad, is that if you look before, say, 1600s, definitely by 1700, Blacks in Europe are treated as kind of cool because, like, whoa, hey, what's going on? You know, and it wasn't this simple, you know, racialized inferiority. Often there was a lot of curiosity, like, what type of person is this? And so really kind of what happens is, again, this is, the lesson here is people who didn't know each other are interested, but once they start to get to know each other, they start taking advantage of each other more. So it's kind of it's the opposite of like a buddy comedy, you know, or like the two guys. It's like Rush Hour with like Jackie Chan and Chris Tucker or whatever. Like as they're hanging out more, they become buddies because they understand each other. This is the reverse. It's like as Europeans understood more about Africa, they knew more how to exploit it and get what they want out of it. And African kings realized how much more money they could get from selling their enemies. And so it's kind of the worst. You learn more about your enemy if you do better for yourself. So we also know that different countries have different definitions of race. So for example, in Brazil, you're considered white if you're considered what we would call white if you have any Caucasian in you. So you can find people who are very dark skinned who will say, I'm European. As a matter of fact, at one time, Richard Nixon in the 60s, he went down to Brazil. He was driving through Rio de Janeiro, and the president of Brazil, because he's Nixon, so he's kind of racist, he was like, hey, how many of these people, looking at this crowd of very dark skins, how many of these people are white? And the president said, about 80%. And Nixon about slid out of his chair because it didn't look like it and hit to his eyes, obviously. So different cultures, different ways of defining what race looks like and what the colors are. But that's kind of the point, right? Is when Africans are rare, they're interesting. It's once they become normalized that then you're like, wait a second, they don't like us, and I bet we can take advantage of them.
So you say this. So does that still kind of connect to? I guess this is kind of bringing identity politics into it. Does that still kind of connect into an identity there that this person is still African in a way?
Keep going, Colin. I help flesh that out a little more for me.
Basically, you were saying how I guess it comes across as exotic, I suppose, as to what makes them more special. Does that still kind of dig into I guess, antiquity / medieval / Renaissance version of identity politics in a way?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Yeah, I think when you get down to it, we're always forming our identity by the things we know, who we call ourselves, like who we define ourselves as. So I think you're right. In the Middle Ages, of the amount of knowledge in Europe's pretty low, and so new and exciting things are new and exciting things. Again, the average serf in 1350 isn't really thinking about taking over any continents anytime soon. So I think that makes it a lot easier to just be interested in the novelty and not immediately turn it into this unit of production I'm ready to steal. They're not there, So I think you're right that identity is part of the question. Actually, we'll get to that maybe next week, because there are a number of people in early Virginia, black men, who owned up slaves. And that, of course, raises really interesting questions about identity. So we'll get more into that, but I think you're right that it's central to this question. Jessica.
So I was wondering, because you had mentioned how like this labor system from Europe then meshed with like this practice of selling your enemies, of selling people that you conquered, or going together and fusing, and how those were like there were people on both sides who were starting the slave trade. And then what happens like after that first 100, 200 years? Like what happens in Africa? Is there documentation about like how those empires
that's the whole next part of the story. Basically what will happen is that as Europeans start paying good money for slaves, they get hungry. You know, it's the addiction, right? They're making so much money selling slaves to owners in the New World that they start showing up more and more often. Instead of saying, I want 5, I want 20, I want 292, fill my boat. And pretty soon African kings start saying, hey, I don't have any more people. And so that causes wars to happen more rapidly, because if you're the king of Ghana or whatever, it's like you are right next to the European boats that show up and they have guns. So you need to go farther into the continent and get more people and bring them out, or else they're going to take your people. And so what happens is this really vicious cycle as African kingdoms are all, and you're right, Jessica, to ask like, what's the fallout for Africans? African kingdoms are almost all of them are destroyed within basically 200 years because they simply can't get enough people fast enough. And it turns out if you're the one powerful country and you try to attack all your neighbors to take their people, they gang up and take you down. But then they're not strong enough to beat each other up. And so pretty soon, all these empires, some of which lasted 400 or 500 years, all start collapsing one after another. And by the time we get to, I think I'd say by the time we get to the late 1600s, it's no longer a participatory trade. It's Europeans show up and they get people on their boats, period. Does that make sense? So you're right. We're going to get to a place where it's just straight up man stealing, but we don't start there. Actually, I think that's one of the things that that's one of the things that's made us not know about those African kingdoms, right? Is every one of them gets destroyed. And so we don't have sources or material. So we don't really have much of the African take on what was happening. Again, if you lived in Mali or Ghana, nothing changed. You're just selling more people, but you did that for 400 years. Why do they keep showing up every 6 months demanding more? Well, that's the change. Good question.
I've got a question for you.
Oh, go ahead, Cody.
You said just within about the past 30 years, they've started to really study the history of these areas in Africa.
Yeah.
Was it just willful neglect of material that no one wanted to study? Or like, where is the source for this, information that they're discovering?
Yeah, well,
did it exist or? Yeah.
Most of it's gone. I mean, the reality is that I think that Mali had a writing system. Timbuktu did. I don't think Gao did. So some of those empires had full-on writing systems where they would have, kept good records, but a lot of them were destroyed. And also, a lot of early European explorers. We're talking. I'm jumping way ahead. We're like in 1850 now, but the first African, explorers who went into the center of the continent, they didn't think any of this stuff mattered. And so they never bothered to keep or record anything. And, actually a good way to think about it, Cody, is if you were a culture that had writing and then you lost it, what would you do with your records? Like a good example would be the Mayans. The Mayans were able to write for 800 years. And when they lost the ability to read their writing, well, they didn't keep anything because you can't read it, right? So I think part of the sad reality is once these kingdoms fall, when their literacy rates drop, if you can't read the local tongue anymore, why would you keep a bunch of old, pieces of wood and stuff with scratches on it? It doesn't mean anything to you. And if you're in a civilization that's literally, exploding at the seams, that's the last thing you worry about. These are people just trying to live anymore and not get, taken by a slaver. So I think you're exactly right to ask, where do we get sources? And the short answer is, a lot of what we're doing is we're trying to work backwards. We're trying to say, oh, these three people have the same last name, or we know from a slave owner that they talk the same language with each other, so they must be from the same place. A lot of it is working backwards. I'm not up to date on the very, very latest stuff, but I don't know of any major document caches from North Africa. I can't believe I'm saying that, but I literally don't know of any until you get across the Sahara to the small Arabic cities that were on the coast. They have sources, but I don't think we have any internal African sources, even no major ones I'm aware of. So, and that's the sad reality, right? Is that like we missed the opportunity. Whatever there was to learn, we're doing guesswork now. You know, that's really sad. Good question.
That was actually going to be very similar to my question. So I'm glad you just asked that. And that was, are there any ancient, I think you just answered this, but are there any ancient African writings that talk about those empires? I mean, we have the Bible, and that gives us the Middle East, and it gives us some of Africa, a little bit of that history, but is there any other writings that are just as ancient that talk about any of that? And it sounds like there's not.
Yeah, not really. And again, so the one thing that helps a little is that Islam begins to expand in the 700s, starts in the middle 600s, starts to expand in the 800s, and by 1100s, covering almost the entire Middle East and parts of North Africa. So the Muslims begin, the Muslim empires begin keeping records that help us somewhat with this. But again, you know, they're not interested in what's going on in Africa proper. They want to know, what can I take out of there to trade? And so their interests are just not. I mean, again, it's like, John, if a traveling salesman, if he dies and 1,000 years later, I get his Rolodex or something, you know, I can learn some things from it, but I'm not going to get the information I get from his actual customers, you know, if they still existed. That's a terrible metaphor, but anyways.
It works. I got it.
Savvy's shaking her head. She already knows I'm full of bad metaphors. This is what I do. Sorry.
Yeah. If you say, what is it? Showing my cards?
Yeah.
You've already said it once. You're going to say it every time now.
Dang it. All right. I got to stop. I've got a couple like verbal tics like that when I teach. All right. Okay. A couple more questions, maybe one or two more. Next time, I think next time I want to talk about changes in the church, because the Catholic Church actually changes its definition of what type of people you can own. And we'll get into that. That's that's not going to be good. Sorry, John.
I'm okay. History's real. It happened. It's cool.
All right. John's a resident Catholic, so we got to be nice to him. So, all right. Any other questions? Or comments. If you just want to say something, please feel free.
Are you gonna
early for the time period? But do you think that Portugal and basically South America being the dominant owners of Black slaves at the time plays a role in what we see with the Latino and Black communities today?
Wow.
And is that something you think we'll eventually touch on, or I should just go find my own books on that?
Yeah, maybe go. I actually think that that's mostly a product of American politics, because in American politics, we tend to have, you know, like most white people vote for one party, most minorities vote for another. Like that's the case the last, you know, 70 years, and probably back until like 1920. So I guess it's about 100 years now. So I think, Savvy, that's probably more a product of recent American politics, because if you look at the historical understanding of Latinos and Latinas, they tend to dislike Blacks. In fact, actually Colombia is really famous because Colombia, I guess, I don't know how to say it right, Colombia in South America, their actual founding myth is about how they were indigenous, but they got whitened, and the dangers when Black people showed up. So their own national myth is literally, we're Indian, and that's okay, but not great because we're Indian, but the white people showed up with civilization, that was awesome, but they also brought Black slaves, and that wasn't awesome. And so they have this very complicated national theory about race. There's actually a really good book on that by I think it's something Applebaum's her name, and she actually kind of brings this up because she's like, what do you do as an American scholar when the first person you interview says, you know what, I wish that no Black people came to Columbia? And you're like, how do you know? It's just really a head snapper, because that's not how we think about our history, right? Like we're like, Yeah. Anyway, so I suspect that our experience, Savvy, is more American and more recent and political. I think historically in South America, there's been much more animosity between Latino and Latina people versus Black people. Good question, though.
Are you going to cover how you're going to kind of break this whole thing up? Kind of give us an idea of kind of what to expect here?
I think they're going. Most of the sessions will be like this, Cody. But I don't. This is the first one. I have no idea what they're going to look like. I had kind of a rough idea where I want to go. I think I want to just move chronologically, covering how these things are changing. But if you got a special interest or something you want to dive into, let me know. I just want to try to. Yeah. I want to cover the history first before we do any politics, and that's not because I don't think politics and George Floyd and all those questions right now are important, but simply I feel like the best thing I can do as a historian is be like, okay, let's just talk about how this developed. Because the question of politics is really hard. It's like, what do we do now? And no one knows what to do now, right? So I just want to be like, hey, let's talk about where this came from. That's the first thing. We know that well. Then we can talk about wise solutions. But we got to cover that first. So
yeah,
sort of an answer.
Cool.
Thank you.
I have a couple comments real quick.
Sure. Go ahead. John, then Jessica.
For one, I hope whatever you're going to go up to covers how slavery was involved in the Industrial Revolution or how it impacted the Industrial Revolution.
Good point.
So that's a tip or one thing that I'm hoping to learn about while you're doing it.
Yeah, there's a whole literature on the connection between slavery and capitalism. And it's very fascinating and very controversial because we know that slavery and capitalism developed at the same time, but that doesn't mean they're the same thing. And so, again, I'm savvy, I'm going to say it. I'll show my cards as a historian that I think they're actually distinct. And so that's why when people say, oh, capitalism is slavery or slavery is just capitalism, I think they're more new. I think it's more complicated than that. I think it's much more nuanced. But is it true that early capitalism was defined by building a slave trade? Oh, yeah, absolutely. If there's no slave trade, there's no mass production of goods in the colonies moved to Europe. So, like, they're deeply connected, but they're not the same thing. But yeah, good question, John. I'll definitely talk about that because that's an important topic.
I'm kind of curious about today. I'll do the same thing, lay my cards out here at the same time. I'm kind of wondering how much, as a white person today in America in 2020, how much did I benefit from the slavery of 200 years ago, 150 years ago? How much of this nation was built on the backs of free labor and that are now systems that we're all involved in? Like, for example, there's at least a part of it, at least a portion. And then, so being born into that system, I come into a system where everything's created for me. I don't have to.
You just step into a room that's already furnished, if you will.
Exactly. So I'm just trying to understand a little bit more about how much am I benefiting right now from what was going on then.
Well,
and I don't expect you to answer that right now, but
that's such an easy question to answer.
Yeah, okay. Go for it.
Yeah. I'm going to kick that down the road. We're going to get more to that, but I think one of the things that complicates this is America has a history of immigrants, right? Like almost all people in America are not the original, 50 years of white settlement, let alone the indigenous people here before. And so one of the fascinating things about American history is like, who counts as which team? Who's benefiting? And I'll give you one last example. And Jessica had a question. There's a famous guy named Colin, did you write your paper on Charles Colcock?
Which one?
For Civil War, did you write the paper on Charles Colcock Jones, or was that somebody else? No, that was Mitch. Mitch did that.
I was going to say, I can't recall that name at all.
Sorry. One of the guys in our Civil War class last year wrote a paper about this guy named Charles Colcock Jones, and he basically went to school. He was a Southerner, born to a Southern landowning, slave-owning family. He went north and basically became convinced that slavery was morally wrong because he went to seminary with a bunch of Yankees, and they're like, I think he became convinced that it was not right. But then he found out his father died, and so now he owns like 70 people. And he writes this amazing thing in a letter to his wife where he says, I come into this with wealth entailed from my father. And entail is a very old word. It's a feudal word of all things. And it literally is what you describe the duties that go from a son to his son in feudalism. It's a way of saying, in other words, is like your point, John, I didn't ask to be a slave owner. And if I said tomorrow I'm going to get rid of them, I still get the house. I still get the horses. Like, I still get all these things if I even end it right now. And so he says, like, it's entailed to me. I can't escape the thing given, even if I get rid of it. And he says, I don't even know what to do. And he ends up, and again, make of it what you will. He tries to Christianize all his slaves because in his mind, that's the best thing he can do. And he doesn't want to free them because he's like, they have no money, no land, nowhere to farm. So I'm better off being a good slave master than freeing them. And again, we can debate if that's true, but like that's the power of entail, right? That he's like, if I do nothing, I already am winning. I've already got the benefit. And I think that's, for me, John, that's what's so fascinating about this is like, we can't even quantify things. And even if we could, can we undo them? And I don't know if that's true. Okay, that's a whole nother field of discussion. All right, Jessica. Yeah, Jessica.
I just wanted to ask a little bit about the logistics here. So like, I noticed that like you had like maybe 4 days that you were planning on like hosting the Zoom call. Like, are you planning on talking about like this topic, like this same section this whole week and then like moving on next week? Or like how is that working? And then like I also noticed that you were recording, and so is this recording possibly going to be available?
Yeah.
For people who couldn't participate?
Yeah, I am. I really want to mostly, I think I will make the recording available, but I don't know if I want to make it public. I might put it like on YouTube with like a hidden link. And this maybe gets to Cody's question earlier about like what's the schedule and organization. I think that's my plan. Like you were saying, I want to do for a week or two, all the same sections. So all the people interested can get through it. And then we'll move on to the next topic. Part of why I don't really want to broadcast this is because race is a really, really hot issue. And it's, I mean, again, I don't really want to get canceled if possible. I don't think any of y'all do either. You know, I say that kind of in jest, but also kind of seriously, like we're taking a really nuanced, difficult view. And again, I'm not saying slavery is right. You know, don't ever think I'm saying that, but I'm saying we're trying to understand where does it come from? And that involves asking awkward questions like, do Europeans in serfdom, does that count as the same? Is it different? Do, you know, Irish people who were shipped over as indentured servants, is that the same? Is that not? How do we, and again, the answer, of course, is it's complicated. But these are hard discussions, and so I kind of would prefer having them live with people that know each other, or that at least know a couple people in common. Because I'll show my card savvy. I don't think that reading a book or two about racism is going to fix what's wrong with our country. I think people having honest conversations and knowing the past is going to make us understand other perspectives. You know, it's kind of, back in the day, education in the late modern period was basically you need to read books written by other people about their lives. Like literally some of the earliest education in Europe was reading biographies. Why? The theory was if you read other people's life stories, it will force you to realize I'm not the only person in the world. Other people think and live differently than me. Concept, right? Wow, amazing. That's kind of my goal here is I just want us to bounce ideas, to talk, to think about what history is and how it's different, because the best thing I think we can do as citizens for each other, and again, I add as Christians, is being able to not always be in our own heads and say, what is this like for someone else? And how should that affect my duty to them as a brother or sister, you know, as a fellow human being? So for that reason, Jessica, that's why I really want discussion and Q&A to be part of it. And again, we're still in the 17th and 18th century, so it's easier. It's going to get more contentious as we get more modern. So I think I will make them available for people in the group, but I don't think I'm going to be like blasting them or anything like that.
I was hoping too that as you go along, if you could talk a little bit about, I guess, what you're sharing with us, like how generally well accepted is what you're talking about, or I would appreciate it if you would say like, but this point is really debated. Like some people say, no, it was completely opposite, or it was something like that, and where you get.
I'll save you time and say that every single thing in history is argued about.
Yeah.
I'm I'm doing my best by you as an American historian. My African history is not my specialty, nor European. I've read probably 5 or 6 books on African history, probably about 50 on European history, but my main focus is American history, so I've read about 300 to 400 books on the topic. So I'm giving you my best approximation of the bulk of the scholarship. And there's new stuff coming out all the time, but I'm just trying to give you my best take on what's reasonable. And let me think. I want to think for a second. If there's anything I said in the previous session that's unusually controversial. I think the most controversial thing in what we talked about so far is a lot of historians are worried by the political implications of talking about African roles in slavery. I'm not worried about that because I want to say what happened. Let's talk about everything. And again, maybe I just feel really secure as a Calvinist, but I think all human beings are really terrible and we really need grace. And so I'm like, hey, I will point fingers at every single person that I'm studying, everything they've done wrong, because I don't have any heroes I need to protect. There's only one hero I'm really interested in. Everyone else is just people. So for me, Stephanie, I'm willing to talk about it, but I know there are some historians that are worried by the political ramifications. And John and I met a couple days ago for coffee, and we kind of talked about something like this. I think there are some people who think, well, if Africans are involved, it must be okay. Like, which is not the message of what we're talking about. I wish I knew more about Sahel history in Africa, but I'm telling you what I know as of right now. So if there's points where it's really controversial, I'll let you know. But basically, everything is more or less what seems pretty common historical knowledge, or things that good historians believe. If it wasn't the case, I wouldn't be talking about it because I feel like my professional name's on the line here. So I'm trying to my best to hew pretty closely to what we can prove. So, or prove as you can in history.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Do you have any professors or anybody that you would suggest taking a look at that has done thorough research on African history as much as possible?
Oh boy, yeah. Again, it's so new, Chad. This was the problem. I didn't have to take a single African history class. I chose to take one because I was like, it's a freaking continent. I should know what happened there. But the reality is that it's that understudied. This gets back to Cody's point. The sources aren't there, and so, oh boy, there's a guy named I think it's Adam Greasley. He's a dude I met at the CFH, Conference for Faith and History. It's basically a consortium of Christian scholars, and he wrote a book on German missionaries to Central Africa. I'm so impressed with this dude because he had to learn German, which I've done some, and it's not easy. And he also learned like 2 African languages, so he could read anything that people said in the German sources. If they used any African words, he'd know what they meant. So he learned like 3 languages, wrote a book about it, and he couldn't get a job teaching African history because no one does it. So he's currently teaching European history because he knows German. So the short answer is I don't know. I don't have anybody like on my speed dial. Why am I using old technology metaphors today? I don't have. I said Rolodex earlier. I don't have any great recommendations. There's a lot of really great modern African scholars. Like they're easy to find. But if you want to find a colonial African scholar, it gets hard because back to Cody's point, how are you going to write a whole book with dissertation's a book? How are you going to write a whole book if you can't get any sources? And so unfortunately, it's really hard. I'll try to look around for that. Maybe I'll send you a text because I know that some books have been written, but most of the people who do it, if I'm not mistaken, tend to actually be Islamic scholars, like people saying the Islamic world, early Islam, or medievalists who happen to dabble in Africa. There's not a lot of people who really specialize that I'm aware of yet. But again, fingers crossed. Hopefully, Mali and Ghana are empires. They freaking deserve some historians. So that probably has changed the last 10 years since I had to finish my graduate study, but I don't know off the top of my head. So good question. All right. Anybody else?
What was the name of the guy who wrote the book?
The guy's talking about the African historian. I need to look him up. He's one of my Facebook buddies. I've only met him like 3 or 4 times, but let me look him up. I don't know if this book got published. He wrote a dissertation. I don't know if it ever got published. So it was kind of a bummer. When I met him at Minneapolis 3 years ago at the conference, And I was like, hey, how's the project going? It's like, well, I'm done. And that's the end of that. So it's just a lot of university presses, Jessica. If university presses almost all lose money. And if you tell them, hey, it's on the Civil War, the American Revolution, they're like, oh, we'll sell some copies. If you're like, hey, it's on missionaries in Central Africa speaking German in 1860, yeah, they're not going to sell any books. And so it's really hard to get stuff like that even published. So I don't know if he's able to get it published or not. I'm sorry. So again, this is at the edges of my expertise, but I don't know off the hand.
Send us his name anyways. So if we get like any books or whatnot, if he makes any books, I can look it up and like maybe buy a book.
Yeah, you could support the press, man. Okay, I'll add it to the chat. I'll chat if I find a good scholar. I'll throw it on there. And Colin, I'll find his name, and if he might have an article published, so I'll send that your way if I can find it. All right, 5 more minutes. Anybody else? That's good. Thanks, guys. It's been fun.
Yeah, thank you. Definitely appreciate it, man.
Yeah, my pleasure, John.
It's nice to have classes again.
Yeah, right? Well, I just got an excuse to not grade for the last hour, so I'm super happy, man. I'm good.
Yeah, pretty much.
All right. Well, thanks, guys. Have a good evening, and I'll send what I'm going to do on Facebook is I'll make an actual Facebook group for this, so that way you won't have to look at my post. You can just see it there, and I'll add you to it, and we'll go from there. So, thanks.
Have a good night.
Yeah.
Thanks,
good night,
Steve.
guys. Yep. Talk to you later. See you guys.
Yeah.
Good to see your
Goodbye.
faces. Yep. Bye-bye.